We have the news of Google Podcast discontinuing its operations in the US as early as April 2024. So, what does that mean for you? And what's next? Let's find out. Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts are the top podcast listening apps. What is surprising is that YouTube has left behind Apple Podcast, which was once the most preferred platform for podcast consumption. With an increase in video content consumption, I think we have come to a point where we need to redefine the term podcast. Could this also be a reason why Spotify added a video component to their platform? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Google knows the data and can see where the world is moving. Here's what they had to say when they announced the death of Google Podcast. About 23% of weekly podcast users in the US say YouTube is their frequently used service versus just 4% for Google Podcast. This makes it an obvious choice for them to not have two audio platforms, Google Podcast and YouTube Music. To bring together everyone under the same roof, Google is now going to focus on YouTube Music. With this, podcast creators are promised robust creation and analytic tools, RSS uploads, and YouTube Music listeners. I don't get the point though. To have a podcast on YouTube, you have to just label a playlist as a podcast. And also it appears on a separate tab these days. But I'm not sure if YouTube's algorithm is treating the video labeled as podcast differently than any other regular video on the platform. So here are my questions for YouTube. Firstly, as a voice for audio first podcast creators, how is the algorithm treating these static image episodes differently than the regular episodes? And secondly, for people like me who are creating hour-long podcasts and also doing talking head videos, 10-minute long videos like these, how are these two videos on the same channel being treated differently by the algorithm? Especially as a young creator, I would like Google to give insights into this. But Google has big plans for podcast creators. With YouTube Music, you are allowed to switch between audio and video versions of the podcast. So that is one platform for both audio only and video podcast kind of people. But wait, isn't that something even Spotify does? Spotify is also adding metrics like impressions to tell you how many times your content, either show or episode, has been exposed to users on its platform. Spotify is currently tracking 3 sources: Spotify Home, Spotify Search, and Spotify User Library. If Spotify versus YouTube is real, I wouldn't be surprised if YouTube starts acquiring podcasts just like Spotify did with Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, and others. I mean, YouTube had taken up a similar kind of initiative in the past with YouTube Originals, which in my opinion was YouTube versus Netflix, or was it not? So why is this important for creators like you and I? Because YouTube has a robust algorithm. If you create what people are looking for, discoverability is great on YouTube. If you learn to play the YouTube game, it will rain views, watch time, and dollars. Pretty much every creator's dream, right? Now, what can you do? For now, as a podcast creator, there are 2 things that you need to do. First is get on YouTube Music if you aren't already. And the easiest way to do that is to submit your show to YouTube Music, and that is by creating a podcast on YouTube. The second thing that you need to do is, if you had mentioned Google Podcast as one of the platforms where your listeners can tune into your show, change your CTAs, remove the links of the website, newsletters, email signatures, and wherever you had paste that link. And if you consume podcasts on Google Podcast, then you need to change your podcast listening platform to either Apple or Spotify or YouTube Music. And you can do this by using a migrating tool through a banner at the top of their screen in Google Podcast. I'll link the podcast migration announcement article from YouTube in the description. This migration tool is going to allow you to export subscriptions from Google Podcast as an OPML file that can be uploaded to any other podcast app that supports uploads. In the US, Google Podcast will be available for podcast listening through March 24, and the listeners will be able to migrate or export their subscriptions through July 2024. Looks like YouTube and Spotify are in a race to become the #1 choice for music and podcast consumption. Do you think Google will succeed in crowning YouTube as the most preferred app for podcast consumption? Let me know in the comments below. Check out my video on how you can create or submit a podcast on YouTube. Like the video if you found this useful. Subscribe for more insights on podcasting and content. Hey, if you have a podcast and want to grow your show, check out my ebook 7 Strategies to Grow Your Podcast, Real Case Studies Included. The link is in the description.